This is your fourth lecture for the Introduction to Philosophy, and in this lecture we'll be looking at Socrates, who is considered the first of the great Western philosophers. Do be aware that there are many in scholarship that think that Socrates is actually a fictional character created by Plato and his works, but the majority of historians still believe that Socrates was an actual historical figure.
One detail about Socrates that you need to be aware of that your author did not mention is that although the majority of scholars certainly do believe that there was a historical figure named Socrates, that he did actually exist, there is a minority within scholarship that believe that Socrates was a character that was created by Plato for his writings. And so just be aware that there is a small group within scholarship that will argue that Socrates is a character of Plato's rather than an actual physical human being. Okay, what was Socrates known for other than his philosophy? He was certainly known for his poor hygiene. His clothes were dirty. It's said that he didn't bathe very often. And not only were his clothes dirty, some would argue that he only had one coat or one outer, not a coat like you're thinking of a winter jacket, but one heavier outer garment. His physical appearance is described as very unattractive, physically unattractive. And so all of these details about him being so unkempt and a bit of a clown, a figure that many did not even take seriously, may be somewhat surprising to see that he becomes the father of Western philosophy, and he's able to draw an enormous amount of disciples or students. Socrates was also eccentric and comedic in his arguments. He would often times, whether genuine or not, put on some sort of appearance of being very, very humble, and his opponents would usually begin quite arrogant, and so their arrogance and humility in an argument sort of draw one another like magnets, and then with his questions and his insight, Socrates would turn the table at some point during the debate or discussion and make his opponents, who were the arrogant ones, actually look like buffoons. Socrates' unattractive appearance led him to make arguments that beauty should not be based upon what is pleasant to the eye. We talked about in the first lecture that there's an area of philosophy called aesthetics, and that is the study of beauty. Well, Socrates argued that beauty should be determined by functionality and not just physical appearance. And his most famous example of this is talking about his nose. He's described as having a very broad nose that was turned up at the end so that you could see both nostrils flaring. And he made the argument that that nose, being so broad and having such wide nostrils, allows him to smell much better than someone who may have what you would consider a prettier, slender nose. And so Socrates says that physical appearance should not determine beauty, but functionality should. The tension between knowledge and ignorance was very important to Socrates. He emphasized quite often that it is very, very important to know what your limitations are and to be able to state the areas where you do not have expertise, where you do not have knowledge. He said that from this point is where you can begin to actually build knowledge. Socrates had very little patience for those who would pretend that they had knowledge in all sorts of areas of study where they actually had none. I'm sure we all have friends like that. I know that I certainly do, that no matter what the issue or the topic is that's brought up, they will always have an opinion and will always have some sort of exposure and expertise to that issue. Socrates would just prefer that we say we don't know. An example for me, if someone gets in a conversation about music, whether singing or playing an instrument, I automatically would say I have nothing really to offer to this conversation because I have no musical gift, no musical aptitude whatsoever. And so Socrates would rather that we do have this understanding of knowing ourselves. You see that here in quotes, know thyself. This becomes very important to Socrates' philosophy, and he makes the argument that before you can have any sort of knowledge on a subject matter like astronomy, religion, mathematics is what I have listed here. Today we could add in certainly other things like psychology and biology and chemistry. So before you can really claim to have any knowledge on that particular area of study, you have to have a self-awareness. You have to know who you are so that you know the way that you're going to approach that particular subject matter. What is the self? Well, Socrates uses the term psyche, which we translate into English as soul. So know your soul. And this emphasis often served Socrates well in his debates with others, because he was so self-aware, he was able to detect where his opponents lacked self-awareness. Socrates also used a dialectical philosophical debate. That means it's a real quick back and forth style of debate. So rather than Socrates making a lengthy speech and then an opponent making a lengthy speech and going back and forth that direction, what you have is a comment made by Socrates' opponent, and then Socrates will raise a question. The question is oftentimes ironic in the sense that it appears to be saying one thing on the surface, but really there is a deeper level of understanding to what Socrates is saying that oftentimes would be the exact opposite of what it appears he's saying on the surface. Please be aware that this sort of back and forth model of debate with these ironic questions undercutting his opponent is referred to as the Socratic method. There is one particular debate that Socrates had that I want you to be aware of some of the details on. The opponent for this debate is a man named Thrasymachus. Before we get into Thrasymachus, though, let's look at the background of what's going to be happening in this debate. What's going to be the question here? Well, we already saw that the psyche, or the soul, is very important to Socrates, and he said the most important thing about the soul is that it have virtue, the Greek term you see here in italics, arete. Several virtues, generosity, kindness, gentleness, but we see that Socrates stressed that wisdom is the highest of all virtues, because wisdom can take all other virtues and figure out how to apply those virtues, how to apply that knowledge in the real world to accomplish something. If you accomplish something good through virtue, this is called techne. Certainly the root there for words like technology and technician. And so this is what Socrates considered to be the good. To know thyself, to know your soul, to realize that the most important thing about the soul is that it have virtue, and then that wisdom is the highest of all the virtues because it can use the other or apply the other virtues to do good deeds, and the good deeds are the techne. So hopefully you can kind of connect the dots there. And so with Socrates having this approach, he is challenged by a sophist, Thrasymachus, and Thrasymachus, as a sophist, follows the theme of moral realism, that if you have power, whatever you do is automatically right because you had the power to do it. And so this is going to be a debate between power and wisdom. What determines what is good? What determines who is right? And so again, Thrasymachus is saying it is power. Socrates saying it is wisdom. As they go through the debate, we finally get Socrates to have Thrasymachus admit that leaders like emperors or kings are fallible beings. They can make mistakes. And so even though they have all the power to make all the laws that they want to make to benefit them, there's a possibility that they would make an unwise law that would therefore actually hurt them. Maybe a particular way of taxation that they thought would benefit them, but somehow it ends up coming back to hurt them. And so with this idea of human leaders being fallible, this brings the debate back to Socrates as really the winner here, in stating that wisdom has much more to do with being right than power does. Okay, we do have a trial of Socrates eventually comes about in the midst of conflicts between Athens and Sparta. Some of the politicians of Athens suspect Socrates of being a traitor. This is unlikely. What is more likely is that through his emphasis on virtue, Socrates was overcoming the ethnocentric views of the sophist. If you remember that from a previous lecture, the sophists being ethnocentric means that they sought a way to show how their people, their culture is always the best and everyone else is inferior. Socrates did not hold such ethnocentric views, and this was looked at as a lack of patriotism of sorts, and so therefore he's accused of being a traitor. He's also accused not only of this treason, but of leading the youth of Athens astray with his teachings. Now, according to some accounts, Socrates' trial is before a jury of 501 members. And this makes it impossible for there to be any genuine communication between the jurors. If you have 12 people, you can have genuine communication around a table. 501 people, that sort of communication that's needed cannot take place. The trial is rigged by the Athenian politicians, and Socrates is found to be guilty. Now, prior to the trial, Socrates had the chance to escape and live in exile, but he refuses this. And after the verdict, Socrates' jailers, having grown fond of their prisoner and talking with Socrates, they grew to like him. They offered him a chance to escape, that they would turn and look the other way and he could go. But Socrates refused this. Socrates' sentence will be that of death. He'll have to drink a poison liquid called hemlock, and this will cause his death at the age of 70. Now, he had at least two chances to escape. Why didn't he do this? Well, in remaining consistent with his beliefs, Socrates followed the path of intellectualism. That if you hold convictions, if you hold beliefs, then you need to live those beliefs out. Remember, if you have the virtue, the arete, you need to apply it, the techne, to achieve the good. Well, Socrates believes, he has the conviction that his soul is immortal, and so death is merely a passage to something else. He doesn't claim to have any knowledge of what that something else is. Remember, he's someone who knows himself, knows what he knows, but will also say what he doesn't know. So he does not know what comes after this life, but he does have this conviction in knowing himself, knowing his soul, that that soul is immortal, and therefore it would be a contradiction that if this world has found fit to give him this sentence of death, then he will follow through, trusting that his soul remains immortal and there will be something else. Now, one last realization I would like you to have about Socrates is that because we don't have any of his own writings and everything simply comes from Plato and a handful of others, and Plato was his prize student, and so it makes a lot of sense that Plato is going to have a very, very high view of his teacher. So just realize we really, with Socrates, don't have any sort of certainty with how accurate our accounts about him are, because as the prize student, Plato is certainly going to romanticize and sentimentalize the story of his great teacher. But this is an interesting part of the course because we do have the three most profound thinkers for the beginning of Western philosophy, one right after the other, and all in teacher-student relationships. Socrates becomes Plato's teacher, and then Plato will become the teacher of another great philosopher named Aristotle. Okay, I said on an announcement earlier this week that just to make sure that you're listening to these lectures and not just reading the material on the non-narrated versions, that every now and then, probably every other lecture, I'm going to throw out some sort of just pop culture trivia thing. And if you email me the answer to the question, and this is just fun stuff, nothing serious here, but if you email me the answer to my question, then I will add 10 extra points to your reading quiz. Okay, so we do have our first one for this lecture. In the 1980s, there was a very popular comedic film about two high school students who neglected to complete a history project. And so they have a phone booth that allows them to travel back through time, and they use this phone booth traveling back through time to go back in history and collect very important historical figures. The very first figure they collect is this philosopher, Socrates. And one more clue to help you out within the throughout the entire movie, the way these two teenagers pronounce Socrates' name is Socrates. So if you can find out the name of that movie, do a Google search with some of the details I just gave you, and you email me the title of that movie, and you get 10 extra points.